Hi, I'm Chris Martin, a student program manager at the Yale Center for Business and the Environment, and I'm here with Dr. Tom Lovejoy. Tom is a professor in environmental science and policy at George Mason University and a senior fellow at the United Nations Foundation. Tom is a biologist and environmental scientist known around the world for coining the phrase biological diversity and conceiving of the debt for nature swap concept, which will be the focus of today's discussion. Thank you for joining us, Tom.
Good to be here.
I'd love to start off just by asking you to explain, what is a debt for nature swap and how does it work?
Well, the original debt for nature swap was always an international swap. There may, in fact, be one in process right now with Puerto Rico, which will be totally within the U.S. But basically, in the early years, it involved nations which were seriously indebted to commercial banks, and that debt being available at a discount on a secondary market. And so if you could acquire that at a discount and then by pre-arrangement with the country in question, essentially redeem it at face value in local currency, not hard currency, but local currency, that was considered a good deal by the country from a fiscal point of view, and it could be applied to anything, commercial or whatever, but as proposed for debt for nature for conservation. And so it was pretty simple and in the abstract, but every deal becomes quite complicated and different from every other.
Sure. Well, thanks for that initial explanation. Could you talk a little bit about how you first came up with the debt for nature concept when you wrote the opinion piece in the New York Times back in 1984?
Yeah, so I went to participated in a hearing, and I think it was in the House, but I'd have to go back and check now. And the hearing was about the environmental bad effects of multilateral World Bank kind of development projects. And Jose Lutzenberger, who then was a civil society guy in Brazil, later became Minister of the Environment, got up and he started going on about the social effects and how it was leading to migration and this and that and the other thing. And what it made me realize in my mind was that the debt itself was causing environmental problems. It wasn't directly, but indirectly it was causing them. And so that led me to begin to think, I mean, surely there must be some kind of way you can turn this around and have it not do bad things, but have it do good things. And so I wrote it up as a general proposition for the New York Times. And as I like to say, you never get to choose your own title for anything you write for the media. And they chose a really good one, which was called Save Debtor Nations, apostrophe S, or S apostrophe, Ecology. And so the idea was out there that you could do something to flip this around with debt, but it actually took 2 or 3 years before the conservation community discovered a way to actually do it. And when they did it, they mimicked sort of the for-profit world, which had figured out that you could buy this debt at a discount and then use it to buy a factory in Brazil or something like that.
Sure.
So following exactly the same mechanism, the first one was done in Bolivia, 1987. And not long after that, I ran into my good friend Roque Sevilla, who at that time was head of the Fundación Natura in Quito. He later went on to be mayor of Quito and head of the mayor's organization for Latin America, and got them into ecosystem services and protecting their watersheds. But so I just gave him the idea, and then I saw him 2 or 3 months later, and he'd already done the deal.
Oh, wow.
And in that case, the debt was used to fund 10-year bonds denominated in dollar equivalents to double the budget of the National Park Service of Ecuador. So basically, you can use it for anything.
Sure.
It's just money.
Sure. And so around that time, I believe you were the director for the World Wildlife Fund US?
Yeah, I think I was executive vice president for World Wildlife Fund US, something like that.
And WWF kind of took the lead on making quite a few of these early day debt swaps happen, right?
WWF got really engaged, but CI did plenty, and Nature Conservancy did too. And each one was a different deal. I mean, it's fascinating.
Sure.
You get a good financial mind working on one of these things, and each one will be different.
And what sort of initial reactions did you see once, you came up with the idea, once it became a reality? Did people like it? I'd imagine within the conservation community, it must have been, seen as the next big innovative way to finance conservation.
Yeah, so when the idea first came out, people outside the conservation community thought it was absolutely crazy, because banks, after all, are where you put your money to keep it safe, not to give it away, right? But financial minds are financial minds, and if the for-profit world was recognizing this as a mechanism, there's no reason you couldn't use it for socially worthwhile purposes. And I think maybe what it did more than anything was free people to think creatively about finance in the world of conservation.
Okay, sure. And how have you seen the practice of debt for nature swaps evolve over time? I'd imagine it's gone through, different phases and changed quite a bit.
Well, it's very interesting. So, the first big phase, if you want to call it that, was with the discounted debt of the commercial banks. But eventually those nations, got out of their indebtedness, and there was not a lot of that around. And then began a phase which still occurs, in which it's government-to-government debt. And so the recent Indonesia rainforest, I think there were some coral reefs in it too, done when Hank Paulson was Secretary of Treasury, was Indonesian debt owed to the United States forgiven for appropriate compensation for conservation in Indonesia. And then interestingly enough, we're now seeing within nation debt swap being worked on right now with Puerto Rico, which is hugely indebted. It's not an actual state, but it is part of the United States. And I think what they're going to try and do is secure a significant amount of it to essentially protect for the long term the natural infrastructure of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico.
Okay.
Could be really exciting.
Sure.
Nature Conservancy is doing that one. And then much more recently, the example you brought to my attention with the Seychelles, which is called a debt for climate swap. And it is in one sense, but to the extent that all of the debt swaps have been about protecting nature, and nature, the living part, is all built of carbon. It's probably always been, whether explicit or not, useful from a climate point of view. But I think what's really exciting about the Seychelles one is that it involves debt owed to multilateral institutions, like the ones that were being seen to create problems in that hearing long ago.
Sure.
And the debt of an institution like the World Bank is managed by a group of donor nations. It's not a single nation. So that makes it very, very complicated. And that's why, until this, I don't believe there's ever been a World Bank debt swap. And there are a couple of reasons for it. One is that the World Bank's rates are some of the most attractive in the world, and so that's the last debt that nations default on. But also because you have to deal with the group. You can't deal with a single nation, and that means it's much more difficult. Essentially, I don't know whether there's a veto power, of each participant or not, but it just makes it much, much more complicated. But that group is called the Paris Club, and they clearly agreed in the negotiations for this one that the Nature Conservancy has done for the Seychelles.
Sure, and yeah, I also thought the Seychelles deal was very interesting, and kind of, to me, it seems like it's shifting the norms of the debt for nature swap, going from a more terrestrial conservation focus to marine focused, also focused on climate adaptation.
So there's nothing about debt swap that ever meant that it had to be just terrestrial. And I think, in fact, there have been a couple marine ones before. But what is so interesting about this is it's both. And it's a huge area. It's like 400,000 square miles, if I remember. It's big.
Yeah. Does this deal, especially the point you talked about it being debt from the Paris Club, from a multilateral institution, does that kind of show you that the debt swap, the debt for nature swap in the future has a lot of potential to continue to play a role in conservation finance in new contexts?
Yeah. So my sense is that debt swap and sort of debt constructed financing it probably will always have a role to play. Question really is, can you ever get that in truly significant numbers? And I'm not sure that is possible, just because of the way financial institutions are built. They do have to repay their debt from time to time if they want to survive. So it won't be like massive, direct foreign aid. On the other hand, it's in many cases it's money that actually is not going to be repaid. And if you can recognize some value in it this way, you've actually improved the whole situation. So there was a time, for example, in Peruvian debt you could buy for 2 cents on the dollar, right?
Yeah.
And imagine what you could do with a lot of that, right?
Sure. I think another interesting point about the Seychelles deal was that it was paired with impact investments. So actual, part of it was based in buying debt. Another part was investments. So do you think it has, even if debt swap doesn't have potential to provide huge funding, do you think it has potential to leverage, say, private sector conservation investments?
Well, certainly. I mean, you can put these things together any way you want. and even some of what debt is used for can essentially, you can use it for anything you can use money for. It just is a different kind of money, right? And that's a really very important point, because you'll from time to time see criticisms of debt for nature swaps in which it is portrayed as some kind of fiscal arm twisting on the part of the Greens or some country to another country. And the reality is that none of these things ever happen unless the countries in question want to do them.
Sure.
And so the way I look at it is it becomes a way that the countries that otherwise can't afford to do some things are able to afford it.
Sure. Are there any other kind of challenges or difficulties that you've seen arise during debt for nature swap deals in the past, or following their closure?
So what I've come to conclude is most of the times that one of these projects gets criticized, whatever legitimate criticism there is, and sometimes there is. I mean, like the first Bolivian one just was put together too fast and the local communities weren't consulted. But, that's how you learn. But basically, what I've discovered is that the fault is in the project design or execution. It's not in the financial mechanism.
Sure.
And people, sort of confuse the two.
Okay. Now, I guess, wrapping up, stepping back a little bit away from specific focus on debt swaps, I'd love if you could talk a little bit about, how you've seen funding and financing for environmental conservation evolve over time, and maybe you could touch a little bit on your experience as an advisor to the World Bank and the Global Environment Facility.
Well, actually, if I take it back to beginning to work in international conservation to when I joined the World Wildlife Fund in 1973, conservation finance was through a mail appeal. It was sort of like the Conservation March of Dimes, which most people watching this video won't understand what it was, but it was a fundraising gimmick to raise money to combat polio. And so it was basically a mail appeal, and when you were lucky, philanthropy from individuals and foundations. And it's become much more creative, and it has to become more creative. And there are, impressive sources like the Global Environment Facility, which was created at the time of the 3 Rio Environment Conventions in 1992, is to help the developing nations be able to meet their obligations. But it's only $1 billion a year spread, across the developing world. And the GEF does a remarkable job of getting it matched. So the new 3-nation Amazon project, the first tri-national, even binational Amazon project in the Amazon, has been matched maybe 3 to 1. But it's a long way from what one really does need in the end.
Sure.
So as we look ahead at the challenges of climate change and biodiversity conservation and land degradation challenges and feeding, billions more without destroying any more nature, we're going to have to be really clever about financing.
Sure. And there's been a lot of buzz recently about the potential for private sector dollars, investments, really, to help fill the gap needed for funding of conservation around the globe. Do you think that the private sector could really help here? Do you think that conservation investments, if used properly, if structured in the right way, could help address this issue?
Well, it's an interesting question, and it all depends how it's framed and organized. As long as a company's profits are viewed in a relatively narrow economic lens, there's not a lot of incentive for the company to actually, move outside of that envelope. But if one begins to actually look at true costs or approximating true costs and building that into the way markets work, then it's a different game. And basically, we can't get where we need to get in the world without the private sector. It's 70% of the global economy, and we need some real leadership there that goes beyond thinking about, the quarterly return.
Sure. Yeah.
And there is. I mean, there's some extraordinary leaders out there like Paul Pullman at Unilever and the like.
Sure. And so I just wanted to ask you about a quote I saw of yours back in 1990. I believe you said that in the decade of the 90s, most of the environmental battles in the world would either be lost or won. And now reflecting back on that, 25, 26 years later, do you think there's still hope for the environment? Do you think humanity can still...
Well, there's always hope for the environment. And basically, when you make a statement like I made in the 1990s, what you're really hoping is people will respond to that so that it becomes, in retrospect, a projection and not a prediction. And a lot of things have happened since 1992. The number of protected areas in the world, for example, is incredible. The Amazon is basically, I don't know what it was in 1992, but it was probably 10%, 8% protected. Now it's more like 50%. So there's the challenges are greater. There's no question about it, and they will continue to get more insistent and continue to get greater. But that doesn't mean the response can't be commensurate to it. So the way I look at it is something is not sort of tipped or driven to extinction. There's always something you can do about it.
Sure. And do you see any particularly promising innovations in conservation? Any really strong ideas or frameworks for conservation that looks like they could really make a difference?
So there's a lot of incredible technological innovation that's useful for conservation, just as it is for the for-profit sector. But I think we're at a really interesting moment in which the need to restore the ecology of the planet is actually taking hold. Like reforestation and improving agricultural systems so they accumulate carbon and become more fertile and the like. So I think we could well be on the verge of, and I think we need to enter into a new age of restoration in which there is a profound change in how we view our role with respect to the living planet on which we exist. And I think we have to recognize that we are part of the living planet, and it makes all the sense in the world for us to restore and manage it with respect and actually see our future as though it was embedded in nature and work in that direction.
Great. Well, thanks a lot for being here, Tom. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, good to be here.